In the world of IEM manufacturers, TFC, TRN, Blonde, Moondrop, and Tin Hi-Fi are pretty well known. After all of these companies have released some popular stuff. THIEAUDIO, however, is a brand that is not usually grouped into the ones I just mentioned. Nevertheless, THIEAUDIO has a few stylish IEMs and a planar magnetic headphone. I've been asked a few times to review THIEAUDIO's lower-end IEM, known as the Legacy 2. Linsol was kind enough to send me a review unit of the Legacy 2. Linsol, as you may already know, is one of a few online resellers that specializes in chi-fi gear, selling some of the cheapest to some of the most expensive audiophile toys from China. Take a look at Linsol's website if you get a chance. You'll probably find something that catches your eye. The Legacy 2 is a $100 IEM. Where does it fit in, and can it compete with some of the most popular IEMs in this price range? The Legacy 2, and I'm just going to refer to it as the Legacy from now on, has beryllium drivers. THIEAUDIO makes a few comments about the overall performance of the Legacy. For example, they say that the Legacy will provide powerful sub-bass impact, natural mids, and balanced treble. THIEAUDIO says that the drivers used in the Legacy IEM series excel in technical performance. These drivers are specific to THIEAUDIO and not reused components off the shelf. THIEAUDIO says that the Legacy 2's bass performance is different from the performance provided in the other Legacy products. They say that the Legacy 2 pushes their drivers to their fullest potential. THIEAUDIO also claims that the mids on the Legacy will be neutral due to the Knowles ED29689 mid-frequency driver. Actually, THIEAUDIO says that we should hear, quote, a completely neutral mid-frequency response, accurate mid-treble transition, and a highly resolving treble playback, end quote. From what I can tell in the marketing, the Legacy is supposed to deliver a balanced sound signature. The Legacy is a typical IEM design. Its shape is intended to contour into your ears. The housing is see-through plastic. The housing is also smooth. I could not find the seam joining the two parts of the casing, and frankly, I think that's a good thing. A lot of IEMs use metal nozzles. However, the Legacy uses one seamless transition from body to nozzle, and of course, the nozzle is plastic. The Legacy comes with the standard ear tips. They are silicone. The packaging contains a fairly nice 2-pin cable. It is coated in rubber and does transmit microphonics. However, the cable is not prone to kinks. Finally, the Legacy comes with a carrying case with felt lining. It's just big enough for the cable, IEMs, and spare ear tips. As for comfort, I found the Legacy a very comfortable IEM. It does not insert deeply into the ear canal, which means that it also does not offer much external sound isolation. But in return, the Legacy was easy to wear for 3 hours without any difficulty. This IEM is light and sits securely within my ear. No amount of head shaking was able to dislodge it. Overall, the Legacy is a well-built IEM. For $100, it can be disappointing to see that there is no metal construction whatsoever, but as a consequence of an all-plastic build, the IEM is light and easy to wear for longer periods. The accessories are fairly good, though nothing groundbreaking for this price. Indeed, the Moondrop Aria comes with as good accessories at a cheaper price. I tested the Legacy using various devices. This included my Modi and Liquid Spark stack, the RME ADI2 DAC, my MacBook through the EcoZerta ITM03, and the Ebasso DX160, the 2020 version. I used the stock ear tips and cable. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The Legacy, though a 32-ohm IEM, is fairly sensitive. You don't need a powerful amp, and any mobile device will get the Legacy quite loud. THIEAUDIO says that the bass response for the Legacy 2 is the best yet in this series of IEMs. They say that the Legacy has powerful bass impact. My tests indicate that the Legacy has accentuated sub-bass with average decay and slightly elevated mid-bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, this song starts with a low rumble. The Legacy recreated this detail, and that rumble remained audible throughout this track. The reverberation lingered for a few seconds. When the crescendo hit, the organ was audible, but also melded with the other instruments. There was considerable melding among all instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible, elevated, but frankly not distorted. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were about shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquered by Overwork, there's a rolling marble effect at the beginning. This is supposed to pan from right to left to center. The Legacy recreated the rolling marble sound, but there was no sense of panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the Legacy presented all of them. Their impact was hard, but never sharp. In fact, it sounded almost like there was a sheet in front of these speakers to absorb the sharp thwacking sounds of drumsticks hitting drum heads. All drums melded with each other, but were not veiled. The synth was very easy on the ears, and the Legacy provided some of the most inoffensive representations of the synth in this song that I have ever heard from any IEM or headphone. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, Newpatech, Reel It In, and Uproar. In each song, the Legacy fully recreated the subwoofer effects. Decay was about average. It felt like the subwoofer was at the other end of a medium-sized room. The drums were slightly elevated, but not harsh. There was noticeable melding between sub-bass and mid-bass, but no distortion. The vocals were 2 steps ahead of the instruments. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I used these songs to determine if there is any audible bass distortion. These songs emphasize sub-bass, to say the least. The Legacy passed with flying colors. Even at very high volumes, the Legacy did not distort. Overall, I would agree that the Legacy has emphasized bass. Sub-bass gets a greater push than mid-bass, but both are above neutral. There is noticeable melding between sub-bass and mid-bass. I would say there is about maybe average clarity in this region. Drum impacts are hard, but never sharp. THIEAUDIO says that the Legacy will deliver neutral mids. My tests indicate that the Legacy has very close to neutral mids indeed. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The Legacy presented both details. The grain sounded fairly neutral. The sibilance was marginally accentuated. When compared to my neutral Avantone planar, the Legacy has just a tiny bit more sibilance. When compared to the Allo Audio S4X, the Legacy had a little less sibilance. Orla's voice was about 1 step ahead of the instruments. The drums and guitar had correct timbre. The drums were louder than the guitar, and both instruments tended to meld. In Want You Back by Haim, the Legacy showed just a hint of accentuation to the sibilance in the primary vocalist's voice. At 8 seconds into the track, the vocalist says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The Legacy did present this detail, but it was a little recessed. There are 2 backup vocalists in this song, and initially the Legacy showed both of them, one in the left and one in the right ear tips. When the instruments played at maximum, however, all vocalist voices melded into one, and it was very difficult to separate them apart. The drums, piano, guitar, and bass all appeared to have correct timbre. However, it was evident that the drums were getting a little louder than the other instruments. The vocals remained about 1 step ahead of the instruments. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the Legacy properly recreated the ukulele, drums, and bass. The drums were a bit louder than the other 2 instruments, however. The primary male vocalist's voice was smooth and his sibilance neutral. There is a backup vocalist in this track, his voice layered beneath the primary vocalist, but the Legacy could not separate them. This is, frankly, pretty typical of a lot of IEMs and headphones. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute 20 seconds, there are supposed to be sharp intakes of breaths. The Legacy made this sound more like gasps. Overall, the Legacy has close to neutral mids. Vocals are about 1 step ahead of instruments. Female sibilance is ever so slightly accentuated. There is noticeable melding among instruments, but no muddiness. Vocals are close to the ears. THIEAUDIO says that the Legacy provides balanced treble. I don't know what that means. However, my tests indicate that the Legacy has a close to neutral treble that is just a little rolled off. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the Legacy presented the brass and horns clearly. However, these instruments did tend to meld. At higher volumes, none of the instruments were harsh or remotely piercing. In fact, it appeared that there was a slight roll-off in the mid-treble region. I could not hear individual instruments, but group sets were clear. The timpani was a bit elevated, but did not overshadow the other elements. There was some depth, but no verticality. In other words, some instruments sounded closer than others, but sounds never came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the Legacy made the piano sound like it was about 5 feet away. The bassy notes were slightly elevated, but not distorted. I could just barely hear the pops and sizzles and electric buzzing, details that are at the bottom layer of this track. The cello was very smooth and melded with the piano. I could just about hear the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench and the shifting of the cello's weight, but both details were recessed. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the Legacy presented the piano in the right, the drums in the left, the saxophone center, and the bass one step behind all of these. All instruments tended to meld. The saxophone was smooth, and even at above safe listening volumes, never sounded harsh. The cymbals are struck at different places in this track, and some IEMs are able to present different tonalities of the cymbal strikes with every strike. The Legacy, however, could not. Each cymbal strike sounded just like the one before. I listened to several orchestral tracks, including the Master and Commander soundtrack and several pieces by Beethoven and Bach. On each occasion, the Legacy presented smooth instruments. Instruments always tended to meld with each other, but never became muffled or veiled. Violins and cellos had their characteristic timbres, though with slightly decreased emphasis. Overall, the Legacy provides some of the smoothest treble renditions I have heard for an IEM in this price. The treble region has about average clarity. Details can go missing, or at least can be hard to hear. But in exchange, the Legacy presents treble that is almost neutral and never harsh. If you've listened this far, then you likely have an idea about the Legacy's detail abilities. Let's just say that the Legacy 2 will not go down in history as a detail monster. Actually, it does at best an average job of rendering detail. Very obvious details will be present, but subtle ones will be hard to hear. Nuances of complex compositions would probably disappear. There is noticeable melding among instruments, which leaves little room for details to jump out. While multiple vocalists are generally audible, when instruments play at maximum, those vocalist voices combine into one. Sharp intakes of breaths sound like gasps. Pops and sizzles, electric buzzing, creaking of wood, shifting of cellos might be audible, but typically not clear. More simple compilations, like Guy Clark songs, fare better. When there are only acoustic guitars or only a few instruments with a vocalist, the Legacy does tend to provide a bit more detail. For a more quantitative test, I use the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Blonde BL-03 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 presents 7 to 8. The T2 Plus and Blonde BL-05 present 6 to 7. The Heidi's MS2 presents 8 to 9. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6. The Moondrop Aria presents 7. The Legacy 2 provides 6 to 7 footsteps. This result was consistent with my other listening tests. The Legacy, though not muffled or veiled, is not intended for critical detail retrieval. I would say that its performance is about average. Your mileage will vary, of course, depending on your music and, most importantly, the ear tips you employ. The Legacy has a fairly intimate presentation. Vocals and instruments are always fairly close to the ears. While some tracks will present depth, depending on the original recording methodology, you will not hear a lot of separation between instruments or vocalists. The Legacy does not have verticality. Consequently, you are unlikely to hear sounds above or below. The Legacy is a pure stereo left and right presentation. For the sake of comparison, let's talk about Soundstage of other IEMs. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 has above average soundstage. The Heidi's MS2 is similar to the T2 in this regard. The Blonde BL-03 and the BL-05S are average at best and perhaps slightly below average if we're being completely honest. The Starfield and Aria are average to slightly above average. The Legacy soundstage is comparable to that of the Moondrop Aria and Starfield. In other words, about average. Keep in mind that the different types of ear tips will affect soundstage. Although THIEAUDIO does not specifically say that the Legacy 2 has a balanced sound signature, that's as much as I gather from their marketing, and I tend to agree with the marketing material. The Legacy has elevated bass. While THIEAUDIO might make a big deal out of the bass performance of the Legacy 2, I don't think it is hype-worthy. You do get elevated sub-bass and mid-bass without distortion. There is melding between sub-bass and mid-bass, but that does not result in muffled sound. The bass bleeds into the mids, but again, that does not result in muffled mids presentation. Vocals are easily one step ahead of instruments. While the frequency response graph might suggest recessed mids, that's not the actual experience. Vocals sound natural, and because of the bass bleed, vocals always retain a hint of bass inside. Instruments have correct timbre and about average decay. The mids, in my opinion, are very close to neutral. The treble is close to neutral, but with a slight roll-off. This is not a significant deviation from neutral tuning. In fact, this might be just the right amount for anybody who prefers to listen at high volumes but does not want the sharpness of treble. The Legacy has average at best clarity, detail, and soundstage. It has some depth, but no verticality. The Legacy 2, I think it's safe to say, will provide a warmer sound signature than the typical Chinese IEMs in this price range and below. You will not hear sharp drums, piercing sibilants, or harsh treble. This is not a V-shaped sound signature. Instead, every track I tried was presented in a fairly smooth, relaxed manner. I never felt that the Legacy was overemphasizing any element. While the bass is boosted, it is a far cry from the usual V-shaped tuning. And while vocals do not necessarily stand out, they're also not recessed. Anybody looking for a relaxed, warmer, smooth sound signature may be quite pleased with the Legacy 2. It's not the clearest, widest, or most detailed IEM in the sub-$100 price tag, but it doesn't have to be, and THIEAUDIO didn't promise those things anyway. To better understand performance, we need to do comparisons. It is fundamentally important to conduct A/B tests against gear to figure out where everything is actually situated. To that end, I decided to compare the Legacy to a few popular IEMs. I tested the Legacy against the Tin Hi-Fi T2 Plus, the Blonde BL03, Moondrop Aria, and the Shozy 1.1. While there are plenty of other options, these are fairly well-received products and seemed the right choice for me. I used the stock ear tips and cables for all IEMs. I plugged them into my passive AB switch, which was plugged into my RME 80i2 DAC, and also tried with my Modi Liquid Spark stack. Of course, I tried to volume match. I used my test songs from Amazon Music HD. Please keep in mind that I've already thoroughly reviewed these competitor IEMs. If you want more information about them, watch their respective reviews. The T2 Plus has less sub-bass than the Legacy. The difference is noticeable. Transience is a bit faster on the T2 Plus. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is greater on the T2 Plus. Mid-bass impact is a little harder on the Legacy. Bass clarity is greater on the T2 Plus. The mids are different between these two products. The T2 Plus has greater sibilance emphasis than the Legacy. This emphasis is not harsh, but is obviously different from the Legacy's presentation. Vocals are 2 steps ahead of instruments on the T2 Plus, while vocals on the Legacy are about only 1 step ahead. Separation and clarity is noticeably greater on the T2 Plus. Timbre of instruments is the same. Treble is clearer on the T2 Plus. The T2 Plus adds a bit more energy than the Legacy. Separation of instruments is greater on the T2 Plus. Transience is also faster. Instruments appear further away from the ears than they do on the Legacy. The T2 Plus has wider soundstage and more detailed retrieval. The BL03 has less sub-bass emphasis than the Legacy. Transience, however, is about the same. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is slightly clearer on the BL03. The Legacy has harder mid-bass impact. The BL03's vocals are considerably more sibilant than the Legacy's. There is a rather big deviation between these two. The Legacy is closer to neutral in comparison. The BL03 also emphasizes vocal grain noticeably more than the Legacy does. Instruments have marginally longer decay on the Legacy. Vocals on both IEMs are about 1 step ahead of instruments. The BL03 has slightly more clarity in the mids. The BL03 has a treble emphasis that is noticeably beyond neutral. Instruments are a bit airier and have a bit more clarity on the BL03. However, some brass instruments can become somewhat harsh at louder volumes. The Legacy, in contrast, has a presentation that is closer to neutral with a slight roll-off in the mid-treble region. The Legacy presents instruments closer to the ears. Detail is about the same on both IEMs. Soundstage is marginally wider on the Legacy. The Aria has a sub-bass response that is similar to the Legacy. Both have an emphasis. However, I think that the Legacy has a slightly greater emphasis and longer decay. Separation of mid-bass from sub-bass is a little clearer on the Legacy. Mid-bass impact is a little sharper on the Aria. Bass clarity is about the same. The mids on the Aria are a bit more sibilant than on the Legacy. Vocal grain, however, is about the same. Vocals are closer to the ears and are about one step ahead of instruments on both of these IEMs. Mid's clarity is similar, but the Aria might be marginally clearer. Timbre is the same. Treble response is very similar between these IEMs. The Aria, I think, has a bit more energy than the Legacy. Separation and clarity is slightly greater on the Legacy. Neither IEM becomes harsh even at high volumes. The Aria and Legacy have similar soundstage. The Legacy provides a bit more clarity. However, the Aria has slightly more detail. The Shozi 1.1 has slightly less sub-bass than the Legacy. Transients is marginally faster on the Shozi. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is slightly greater on the Legacy. Mid-bass impact is sharper on the Shozi. Mid-bass clarity is greater on the Legacy. The mids are similar on these IEMs. The Shozi emphasizes vocal grain more than the Legacy. Both IEMs have about the same sibilance emphasis, that is, marginally above neutral. Decay of instruments is a bit faster on the Shozi. Vocals on both are one step ahead of instruments, and are intimate. The Shozi is marginally clearer in this region. Both the Shozi and Legacy have a slight treble roll-off. This appears to be in generally the same narrow band. I think both IEMs roll off the mid-treble region, resulting in some instruments having just a little less energy. The Legacy seems to be a bit clearer and provides slightly more instrument separation. The Legacy has slightly wider soundstage than the Shozi. Detail retrieval is similar. These comparisons demonstrate that there are some standout IEMs while others might be fairly similar. The tin hi-fi gear, for example, remains some of the clearest, widest sounding IEMs in their price range. The BL03 is still sibilant with what some might call shouty vocals. The Shozi 1.1 is a fairly smooth, intimate IEM, similar to the Legacy 2. If I were to pick one IEM from the group that came closest to the Legacy sound signature, I would say it's probably the Shozi 1.1. While there are noticeable differences, the tuning seems to be in the same direction. As always, you may dislike all of these products or may find one or more particularly to your tastes. If you ever want to be confused about audiophile products, spend a few hours trudging through IEM options. There are big IEMs, small IEMs, plastic and metal IEMs, IEMs of all colors, and of course all price ranges. And there's always a new IEM every single month. It just seems to me that with so many options, it must be tough to achieve remarkably different sound with each release. I've also noticed that it is really difficult to find IEMs, or headphones for that matter, which have a softer approach to vocals and treble. I sometimes get asked to recommend gear for those who are treble sensitive, and given their budget, it can be a very difficult task. I don't think there's much need to buy expensive IEMs. If you want clarity, soundstage, and detail, the T2 and T2 Plus are excellent options. If you want a warm sound signature, then the Aria is a fantastic bargain. If you want neutral, well, I'm still looking for a sub-$100 neutral IEM. The Legacy 2 needs to justify its existence. Does it offer enough to warrant the $100 price tag? This brings us to value. Yes, I think the Legacy 2 does provide enough to make it a viable option. I think the price is probably at the extreme end, however. The Legacy 2 provides an emphasized bass, intimate yet full vocals, clear yet fairly gentle treble, average soundstage, and about average detail. It comes with decent accessories. Its build is nothing exemplary, but it is well built nonetheless. The Legacy sound signature is balanced with an eye towards smoothness. Vocals are close to neutral. Treble is just slightly rolled off, resulting in an easier presentation for those who are sensitive to that frequency range. If you're looking for the type of sound that the Legacy can provide, then it is indeed a fine option. While the Legacy 2 does not break ground in technicalities, it is one among few IEMs that caters to a smoother, gentler presentation without becoming veiled or muddy.